Everyone knows the nickname, everyone knows the reputation, but almost nobody knows the truth. Long before the flashing lights, the festivals, and the crowded dance floors, before it became a symbol of freedom, connection, and escape, the love drug had a past that was anything but loving. Its story begins in secrecy, in a quiet laboratory with a discovery no one understood, then vanishes for decades until a therapist unlocks its emotional power, the military tests its darker potential, and an entire underground culture transforms it into a global phenomenon. A drug meant for healing became a drug for experimentation, then a drug for surveillance, then a drug for rebellion. And the world has been arguing about it ever since. Tonight, we peel back the myths, the panic, the hype, and the propaganda to uncover the real history behind the love drug. A story of science, secrecy, war, medicine, and cultural revolution that shaped an entire generation. Now, settle in, soften your shoulders, slow your breath, and let's drift into a story that begins not on a dance floor, not in a neon-lit club, but in a quiet German laboratory more than a century ago, long before anyone imagined that a small, shimmering crystal would someday be called the love drug. Subscribe to uncover more hidden histories and share where you're watching from. Every corner of the world adds a new layer to these stories. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The year was 1912. The place was Darmstadt, Germany, a city of straight streets, steam trains, and the tightly coiled tension of an empire preparing for a new kind of war. Inside the laboratories of the pharmaceutical giant Merck, a chemist named Anton Kulisch sat hunched over a workbench, not in search of euphoria or transcendence, but simply trying to solve a technical problem. The Imperial German military wanted better medicines, agents that could help wounded soldiers survive the industrialized brutality that was spreading across Europe. Kulisch, methodical and precise, was assigned to work on compounds related to hemostatic agents, chemicals that might slow bleeding. He wasn't looking for a miracle. He wasn't looking for a future cultural icon. He was just following reactions, an amination here, a methylation there, building new structures from old scaffolds. Among the many molecules he synthesized was one he recorded in neat handwriting, its formula precise, its structure unremarkable. 3,4-methylene dioxymethamphetamine, MDMA. He didn't take it. No one did. There were no experiments, no speculations, no romantic descriptions of its effects. Merck filed a patent not because they saw promise, but because filing patents was what large chemical firms did. MDMA was shelved, tucked away in the quiet darkness of corporate archives, forgotten almost as quickly as it had been born. While Europe erupted into trenches and fire, while empires rose and collapsed, while decades passed and the world reinvented itself again and again, that tiny molecule sat undisturbed, silent, patient, waiting for someone to notice it. It would take half a century before the world looked again. In the 1950s, the Cold War was not only a struggle of missiles and spies, it was a psychological arms race. Rumors of brainwashing during the Korean War terrified American intelligence agencies. If minds could be reshaped, controlled, or broken, then chemical tools for doing so might become the new frontier of power. Within the CIA, a classified program known as MK Ultra began funding secret experiments across universities, hospitals, prisons, and private laboratories. They tested LSD, mescaline, psilocybin, barbiturates, amphetamines, anything that could alter consciousness, cloud judgment, or loosen a prisoner's grip on their secrets. Buried within these classified files, MDMA made its second appearance in history. Army scientists at Edgewood Arsenal studied it in animals, searching for toxicity, for incapacitating potential, for any hint it might be useful in interrogation or as a battlefield agent. The reports were clinical, bloodless, uninterested in subjective experience. The researchers weren't looking for empathy, they were looking for weakness. And again, MDMA showed them nothing they cared about. It didn't incapacitate efficiently. It didn't cloud the mind in predictable ways. It didn't resemble the dramatic, world-shattering psychedelics that captivated military researchers. And so, once more, it was discarded. Twice discovered, twice ignored. But the third time would be different. In California, a man named Alexander Sasha Shulgin was growing restless inside the rigid walls of the Dow Chemical Company. Brilliant, eccentric, and driven by a deep curiosity about consciousness, Shulgin had become famous in the chemistry world for inventing a successful insecticide. Dow rewarded him with something rare, near-total research freedom. Yet the corporate environment suffocated him, and after a life-changing experience with mescaline, Shulgin left to build his own laboratory behind his home. There, tucked between fruit trees and California hills, he became something the world had never quite seen before. A chemist philosopher, a scientist explorer, someone who believed the mind was a frontier and molecules were keys. Shulgin revisited old patents, old structures, and old forgotten compounds. Among them was MDMA. When he synthesized it, carefully, methodically, with the reverence of someone crafting not a chemical but a possibility, he did something no one before him had dared. He took it. The experience stunned him. Unlike LSD or psilocybin, MDMA didn't dissolve the self or immerse the mind in visions. Instead, it softened the barriers people build around their wounds. It quieted fear. It amplified empathy. It opened, in Shulgin's words, a window. He shared it only with trusted therapists, believing deeply that MDMA could change the way humans heal. And he was right. Therapists witnessed breakthroughs they had never seen before. Trauma confronted without panic, relationships repaired through honest conversation, self-hatred temporarily replaced by clarity and compassion. They treated MDMA with respect, using it as a tool, not an escape. But tools, once known, cannot be contained forever. In the early 1980s, MDMA escaped the therapy room and slipped into nightclubs, first quietly, then with force. In Dallas, entrepreneurs began selling it under a name that would echo across decades: Ecstasy. It was legal, easily manufactured, and astonishingly popular. Professionals, students, artists, and suburban youth all found themselves drawn to this strange new chemical that made strangers feel like lifelong friends and made music feel like a living, breathing companion. And just as ecstasy spread, a new cultural movement was forming, one that would define a generation. Rave culture did not emerge from polished dance floors, but from abandoned warehouses, forgotten factories, and open fields illuminated by lasers and possibility. House music in Chicago, techno in Detroit, acid house in the UK, the beats were repetitive, hypnotic, designed to be felt rather than heard. MDMA amplified everything: the pulse of bass, the nearness of strangers, the sense that for one night nothing in the world mattered except connection. Peace, love, unity, respect. Plur wasn't a slogan. It was a lived reality for a moment. But the light was too bright, the crowds too large, the headlines too sensational for ecstasy to remain in the shadows. In 1984, alarmed by its spread, the DEA moved to place MDMA in Schedule Y, the strictest drug category, reserved for substances deemed to have high abuse potential and no accepted medical use. Therapists fought back, citing the healing they had witnessed. A DEA judge even agreed, recommending a lower schedule that would allow medical use. The DEA ignored him. In 1988, MDMA became illegal nationwide, and with that decision, the government unintentionally created the very problem it feared. By driving MDMA underground, purity disappeared. Pills became unpredictable mixtures of stimulants and toxins. Rave culture was pushed into riskier environments. Harm reduction advocates were threatened or ignored, and yet, demand only grew. Because human beings kept searching for what MDMA offered: connection, openness, a momentary quieting of the fear that rules so much of our lives. Meanwhile, researchers were forced to fight for scraps of funding, battling the narrative that ecstasy caused severe, irreversible brain damage. The truth was more complex, far more nuanced than the slogans plastered across newspapers. But nuance rarely wins political battles. And so, MDMA lived two lives: the demonized street drug and the quiet, persistent therapeutic miracle that researchers were still trying to study behind layers of regulation. This is the real history of ecstasy. messy, misunderstood, shaped not merely by chemistry but by culture, politics, fear, and longing. And the story is far from over. But history has a strange rhythm to it. It loops. It resurfaces. What is buried has a way of rising again, especially when the need that once created it never truly disappears. And by the late 1990s, as governments scrambled to contain the rave explosion and moral panics echoed through the media, scientists quietly began dusting off the old research questions. Was MDMA truly as dangerous as officials claimed? Was the outlaw status deserved? Or had fear and the politics of the war on drugs overshadowed a more complicated reality? To answer these questions, researchers first had to navigate the labyrinthine maze of permits, approvals, inspections, and security requirements demanded for working with a Schedule E substance. Years, sometimes entire careers, were spent just trying to gain permission to begin. And yet, a handful of them persisted. Among them was the same man who had fought the DEA decades earlier, Rick Doblin, founder of MAPS. While the world danced in warehouses and strobe-lit fields, Doblin worked in conference rooms and legal offices, pushing for something revolutionary, a return to legitimate MDMA therapy. It would take time, years in fact, but truth, no matter how deeply buried, has its own gravity. While researchers fought uphill, MDMA continued evolving in the underground world. Rave culture stretched across continents, morphing as it went. In the UK, police raids turned massive outdoor events into tightly controlled club nights. In Berlin, the fall of the wall created a unique playground of abandoned factories, where techno blossomed into a sound that mimicked the heartbeat of a reborn city. In the United States, electronic dance music fractured, then fused, then rose again in the form of massive festivals where tens of thousands converged under fireworks and towering LED screens, chasing the same feeling that first flickered decades earlier. But the joy of the rave was layered over a darker landscape. The purity that defined Shulgin's early experiments and the therapeutic circles of the 1970s was all but gone. In clandestine labs, some remarkably sophisticated, others terrifying in their recklessness, chemists produced MDMA with varying skill. Pills were stamped with logos like Pokemon characters, car emblems, smiley faces, deceptively playful, masking an unpredictable chemistry. Some batches were clean, others were tainted with methamphetamine. Others still contained PMA or PMMA, far more dangerous compounds with slower onset that tricked users into taking more, leading in too many cases to tragedy. And yet, despite the dangers, users weren't seeking chaos. They were seeking what Shulgin once described, an easing of fear, a softening of the inner walls, a sense of connection in a world that often felt cold and fragmented. Ecstasy was not a chemical rebellion, it was a chemical longing. But longing can be manipulated, and prohibition tends to shape drugs in the shadows where truth becomes harder to see. By the early 2000s, scientists were finally allowed to begin human research again. What they found challenged decades of alarmist headlines. The famous brain scan images that had been circulated in news reports, grim images showing darkened, damaged brains, were far less definitive than the public had been led to believe. In many cases, they didn't distinguish between MDMA alone and MDMA combined with alcohol, cocaine, sleep deprivation, and adulterants. Human biology, it turned out, was more resilient than the slogan suggested. Moderate users showed minimal long-term effects. Heavy users showed some measurable changes, but even those were inconsistent, often reversible, and confounded by other lifestyle factors. The terrifying study suggesting extreme dopamine neuron damage had been retracted due to the methamphetamine contamination error. Slowly, a scientific truth began taking shape. MDMA was not harmless, but neither was it the neurological apocalypse portrayed in anti-drug campaigns. The real danger came from something far simpler and far more preventable: the conditions of use. Crowded, overheated environments, limited access to water, panic-driven overhydration, unknown pill contents. These were environmental hazards, not inherent chemical properties, and almost every tragedy linked to ecstasy involved one or more of them. The underground had become dangerous, not because MDMA was uniquely deadly, but because prohibition had created a world where safety could not be spoken aloud. A venue that provided water stations could be accused of promoting drug use. A festival that allowed drug-checking services risked being shut down. Promoters learned that pretending drug use didn't exist was safer legally than acknowledging it and protecting their audience. It was an old story, repeating itself across generations, fear trying to erase reality and reality slipping through the cracks anyway. But meanwhile, another story was unfolding, one that began quietly in small clinics under clinical supervision with careful doses and steady hands. After years of advocacy, MAPS had finally gained approval to test MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD. The early results were astonishing. Patients who had lived for decades with nightmares, panic, hypervigilance, and emotional numbness found during therapy a fragile but powerful window of peace. MDMA didn't erase trauma. It loosened the grip of fear so patients could actually approach their memories instead of running from them. Veterans who could not speak of their experiences without trembling found themselves able to share, to process, to grieve. Sexual assault survivors who had avoided their own histories were suddenly able to explore them without shame. Firefighters, first responders, survivors of violence, people whose lives had been fractured by memory, began stitching themselves back together. Researchers didn't call it a miracle. That word is too easy, too dismissive of the work involved. They called it a catalyst for healing, a catalyst for facing the unbearable, and slowly the world began to notice. As the 2010s progressed, stories of successful clinical trials began appearing in journals, then newspapers, then mainstream media. The results were consistent, profound, and statistically undeniable. Under controlled conditions with trained therapists and pharmaceutical-grade MDMA, the majority of patients experienced substantial reductions in PTSD symptoms, many achieving complete remission, not temporary relief, remission. As the data accumulated, regulators who once dismissed MDMA began to reconsider. The FDA gave it breakthrough therapy designation, acknowledging its transformative potential. Studies expanded internationally. The psychiatric community, long deprived of new tools, began preparing for the possibility that MDMA therapy might soon enter mainstream medicine. It was a strange dual reality. In nightclubs, young people still took unpredictable pills under risky conditions. But in clinics, the same molecule, pure, measured, respected, was offering something entirely different: hope. This contrast highlights the central paradox of MDMA's history. When treated as a weapon, it offers nothing. When forced underground, it becomes unpredictable. But when used with intention, structure, and care, it becomes something else entirely, a bridge between pain and healing, between fear and understanding. Still, nothing in history moves in a straight line. With rising interest came new scrutiny. Critics warned of unknown long-term effects. Moralists insisted that healing achieved through chemistry was somehow less authentic. And governments, never quick to reverse old stances, hesitated to loosen the rigid laws that had been in place for decades. But the momentum was shifting. Too many stories, too much data, too many lives healed. And beneath it all, one truth kept resurfacing. People do not seek ecstasy to escape life. They seek it to feel life more fully, to dissolve isolation, to rediscover connection, to remember what it feels like to be open. Perhaps that is why the story of MDMA is so enduring. It sits at the intersection of chemistry and longing, of politics and culture, of fear and hope. It reflects our deep human desire to understand ourselves, to heal ourselves, to reach toward one another in moments when the distances between us feel impossibly wide. And so, the molecule discovered accidentally in 1912, shelved for decades, weaponized. Unsuccessfully, embraced by therapists, banned by governments, adopted by ravers, demonized by media, and resurrected by researchers, now stands poised at the edge of a new chapter, one that may change how we treat trauma, how we understand emotion, and how we care for the human psyche. But before we step into that chapter, we must finish the story of how ecstasy transformed the world outside the lab. Because the rave wasn't the end. It was only the ignition point. The real cultural revolution was still ahead. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the rave was no longer a secret whispered through payphones and underground flyers. It had gone global. The pulse of electronic music was now the pulse of an entire generation, and MDMA, pure or adulterated, was the unofficial sacrament of this new communal ritual. But as rave culture expanded, something subtle shifted within it. The early utopian dream, the sense of family and freedom that once spread through warehouse crowds like an electric current, began to fray under the weight of commercialization. Not everywhere, not all at once, but gradually, like a glow stick losing its brightness. The earliest raves had been improvised worlds, ephemeral communities built for a single night. People described them as sanctuaries. Even police raids couldn't fully dispel the warmth people felt inside those walls of sound. There was a sense that the rave belonged to everyone and to no one, a collective creation. But corporations tend to notice when something gathers tens of thousands of young people together. Promoters realized there was gold in those gatherings, and slowly the underground nights transformed into festival empires. What was once spontaneous became curated. What was once secret became advertised. Tickets soared, stages became enormous with fire cannons erupting into the sky and digital screens stretching stories high. The intimacy faded. Rave culture didn't die. It just changed shape, slowly contorting around its own success. At the same time, ecstasy, the chemical heart of the movement, began drifting further from its original form. As MDMA was pressured deeper into illegality, darker corners of the underground economy filled the vacuum. Laboratories popped up in the Netherlands, Belgium, and Eastern Europe. Some were run by skilled chemists who tried to maintain quality. Others were run by groups who cared only about profit. And the pills began to change. At first, the early ecstasy tablets were simple, small, and often pure. But by the mid-2000s, pills became unpredictable mosaics of acronyms: MDA, PMA, PMMA, 2CB, methamphetamine. Some were harmless, some were thrilling, some were lethal. A single pill might contain 3 or 4 substances mixed by someone who had never once tested the final product. The logos printed onto pills, Mitsubishi, UPS, dolphins, stars, clovers, became part of the mythology. But they meant nothing. A dolphin one week had no chemical relationship to a dolphin the next. Users relied on online forums and whispered warnings, trying desperately to navigate the dangers of a chemical landscape shaped not by pharmacology, but by prohibition. Yet still, people sought the feeling. That indescribable warmth, the dissolving of walls, the sudden sense that the people around you were not strangers, but companions on some shimmering emotional wavelength. For many, ecstasy offered the first moment in years, sometimes the first moment ever, where they felt safe enough to let the world in, safe enough to feel. And the world kept dancing. Through the rise of festivals like Creamfields, Love Parade, Electric Daisy Carnival, and Tomorrowland, the globe transformed into a network of pilgrimage sites for electronic music fans. People flew across continents to stand in crowds of 50,000, hands lifted, tears streaming as the beat dropped and lights washed over them like a wave. But beneath the celebration, governments intensified their crackdowns. After high-profile deaths, politicians called for bans on festivals, for strict policing, for harsher penalties. The Rave Act in the United States made venue owners liable for drug use on their property. This meant acknowledging the presence of drugs, so that medical staff could respond, became legally dangerous. Water stations were removed, drug-checking kits were prohibited, harm reduction organizations were pushed from venues. Fear replaced pragmatism, and with fear came more harm, not less. Still, as all of this unfolded, researchers continued to inch forward in the world of clinical science. While the rave scene battled public panic, MDMA was quietly becoming something else. Not a nightclub drug, not a counterculture symbol, but a potential medicine with the power to heal wounds that talk therapy, antidepressants, and decades of coping strategies could not reach. By the mid-2010s, clinical trials for MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD were showing unprecedented success. Patients who had tried everything, cognitive therapy, exposure therapy, SSRIs, EMDR, reported breakthroughs after just a few MDMA-assisted sessions. These weren't mild improvements, they were life-altering. One veteran described his first session as the first time I could walk through my memories without my body reacting as if I were still there. A survivor of childhood trauma said, "It felt like the shame was dissolved long enough for me to actually see the truth." A firefighter who had watched people die in his arms said, "For the first time in decades, I could breathe." MDMA didn't erase trauma. It didn't make people euphoric or numb or detached. Instead, it softened the mind's instinct to protect itself by shutting down. Under the drug, fear loosened its grip, allowing the patient to examine their memories without drowning in them. For therapists, MDMA sessions became something akin to guided emotional excavation. The drug made it possible to approach topics that normally triggered panic, avoidance, or emotional collapse. And the patient wasn't passive, they were fully engaged, alert, and coherent, but without the overwhelming fear that usually hijacked the conversation. It was therapy, not a trip. It was medicine, not escapism. But the world is never simple, and MDMA was still entangled in decades of stigma. Critics warned of a slippery slope, skeptics questioned the long-term impact, politicians feared losing control of a narrative shaped by years of anti-drug campaigns. But even with all of these obstacles, the data continued to stack up until regulators could no longer ignore it. The FDA labeled MDMA a breakthrough therapy, a designation reserved for treatments with extraordinary potential. Journalists began publishing long-form pieces on the subject. Psychiatrists who had once dismissed MDMA now discussed its promise at conferences, cautiously but sincerely. The conversation was changing. Meanwhile, in the cultural landscape, something interesting began happening. A new generation of ravers, many born after MDMA had already become a global phenomenon, began approaching the drug with a kind of reverence reminiscent of its early therapeutic roots. Harm reduction organizations grew more sophisticated, offering on-site drug testing at festivals in Europe, Australia, and parts of Canada. Nightlife communities advocated for cool-down spaces, hydration points, and trained safety volunteers. Even some governments, faced with data that prohibition had failed, slowly began shifting toward pragmatic policies. In this new world, ecstasy was no longer just a party accessory. It became a story, one that everyone in the scene knew in fragments, a chemical born in a lab before World War I, a tool of therapists in the 1970s, the heartbeat of the rave movement, a drug demonized by governments, a medicine reborn in the 21st century, a molecule that simply refused to disappear. And that resilience raises a deeper question, one that shadows the entire history of MDMA. Why this molecule? Why did this one, among tens of thousands, synthesized across a century, become so magnetic to human beings? Perhaps it is because MDMA speaks directly to something ancient within us, something older than language, older than cities, older even than the cultures that rose and fell while the molecule slept quietly in Merck's archives. Humans are social animals. We survive through connection. Trauma fractures that connection, turns warmth into danger, trust into threat, love into risk. MDMA briefly restores what trauma steals. It gives people a glimpse of who they were before fear rewired their nervous system. Maybe that is why ravers in abandoned warehouses felt for a few fleeting hours like they belonged to something bigger and kinder than the world outside. Maybe that is why veterans emerged from therapy sessions in tears, overwhelmed by the realization that they didn't have to face their memories alone. Maybe that is why, despite its perilous journey through underground markets and decades of misrepresentation, MDMA has remained. Because it reminds us what it feels like to be human without the armor. And that is something people will cross continents, risk arrests, defy governments, and endure stigma to experience. As clinical trials neared their final stages, whispers of legalization began circulating, not for parties, not for clubs, but for clinics, for therapists, for people trapped in the locked rooms of their own pasts. This potential future, an approved MDMA-assisted therapy, would not erase the drug's complicated legacy, but it would redefine it. It would bring MDMA out of the shadows where prohibition pushed it, out of the warehouses where it became myth, out of the headlines where it was cartoonishly villainized, back into the hands of healers where it began. But before that future could arrive, one final obstacle remained: a cultural reckoning with a century of fear, misunderstanding, and political resistance. Because the story of MDMA is not really the story of a drug. It is the story of us, of what we fear, of what we seek, of how far we are willing to go to feel understood, connected, and whole. And the final chapter, the one we stand on the edge of right now, will reveal whether we are ready to accept what this small, shimmering molecule has been trying to show us for more than 100 years. To understand the future of MDMA, we must stand at the threshold between two worlds, the one shaped by fear and the one shaped by possibility. These worlds overlap in strange ways, much like the dual identities MDMA has carried for decades: club drug and therapeutic tool, outlaw and medicine, symbol of rebellion and symbol of healing. And as we step deeper into the 21st century, the question becomes unavoidable. Which version of MDMA will define the decades ahead? For most of modern history, the story of psychoactive substances has been written by their misuse, not their potential. Drugs are often defined by their most sensational headlines, their worst outcomes, and the cultural anxieties they awaken. LSD became synonymous with counterculture chaos. Psilocybin was dismissed as hippie escapism. Cannabis was demonized for nearly a century. And MDMA, swept up in the panic surrounding rave culture, was painted as a neon-colored poison lurking in the darkness of dance floors. But truth, as always, is far more nuanced. In clinical settings, pure MDMA does not resemble the ecstasy sold on streets or in clubs. There are no colorful pills, no adulterants, no unpredictable mixtures. There's only a carefully measured dose, a trained therapist, and a structured environment designed for safety and emotional exploration. In these spaces, MDMA becomes something fundamentally different, a bridge over the chasm that trauma creates. To appreciate what that means, consider what trauma does to the human mind. It reshapes neural pathways. It teaches the brain to react with fear even when fear is no longer appropriate. It locks memories behind emotional vaults that feel too dangerous to open. Many people go years, decades, without being able to speak aloud the things that haunt them. Traditional therapies often ask patients to confront their trauma directly, but this can re-traumatize rather than heal. The body tenses, the mind retreats, the session ends, and the emotional walls grow higher. MDMA changes that dynamic. It quiets the amygdala, the brain's fear center, just enough to allow the mind to edge closer to painful memories without collapsing. It increases serotonin, oxytocin, and prolactin, chemicals that support feelings of trust, emotional openness, and safety. Under these conditions, therapy becomes not a battlefield, but a sanctuary. This is why therapists describe MDMA-assisted sessions as moments of profound clarity. Patients can speak without trembling. They can revisit memories without dissociating. They can feel their emotions without becoming overwhelmed by them. And, crucially, they can integrate these insights long after the MDMA has left their system. Clinical trials showed results that borders on revolutionary. In one study, 2/3 of participants no longer met the criteria for PTSD after just a handful of sessions. Some who had suffered for 20 years or more walked away with the first real hope they had ever known. These results weren't temporary spikes. They persisted for months, even years. For regulators, doctors, and therapists, this posed a difficult but compelling question. When a substance demonstrates undeniable potential to alleviate suffering, does society have an obligation to make it available? But medicine is not shaped by data alone. It is shaped by culture, by stigma, by political currents that linger long after their original context fades. And MDMA's association with rave culture still shadows it, the same way LSD's association with the 1960s shadowed psychedelic research for decades. People who had never touched the drug carried mental images of glow sticks, crowded clubs, dehydration, tabloid headlines, tragedies taken out of context. To break through those associations, MDMA needed something more powerful than science. It needed stories. It needed the voices of people who had healed when nothing else worked. And those voices began to emerge. Veterans spoke publicly, not with sensationalism, but with quiet conviction. One said that MDMA therapy didn't erase his trauma, it gave him back his life. Another said he felt like he had been living behind a pane of glass for 15 years, and that for the first time, the glass had dissolved. Survivors of childhood abuse described feeling a kind of emotional warmth they had never known. People trapped in cycles of self-blame suddenly saw their experiences with clarity and compassion. Couples whose marriages had frayed under the weight of unresolved trauma discovered they could speak openly for the first time. These stories humanized the science, and they carried a weight that no headline or public service announcement could erase. But the rise of MDMA-assisted therapy did not erase the chaos of the underground market. In fact, the contrast between the clinical and recreational worlds grew sharper as public interest intensified. While therapists worked in controlled environments, ravers continued taking pills whose contents were often a chemical gamble. Festivals swelled to massive sizes, inheriting the contradictions of modern youth culture, radical self-expression paired with corporate sponsorships, communal ideals paired with expensive tickets, and, beneath it all, the same search for connection that had fueled rave culture from the beginning. Even as MDMA therapy gained legitimacy, the illegal market evolved in unpredictable ways. Darknet markets emerged, offering supposedly purer crystals shipped in discreet packages. Harm reduction groups expanded their efforts, bringing reagent kits, test labs, and educational pamphlets to festivals. Europe began quietly supporting drug-checking services as a public health strategy, while the U.S. remained conflicted, torn between ideological prohibition and practical necessity. And through all of this, MDMA continued to occupy a space that no other drug quite filled. It was not a hallucinogen, not a stimulant, not a sedative. It was something in between, something uniquely human-centered, a molecule that unlocked empathy, trust, and emotional clarity. Perhaps that was why it frightened people. Perhaps that was why it fascinated them. As the world hovered on the edge of a possible medical revolution, MDMA forced society to confront uncomfortable truths about trauma, about emotional suffering, about the way we define legitimate versus illegitimate healing. It made us ask why certain kinds of emotional openness are celebrated in therapy rooms but criminalized on dance floors. It challenged us to consider that the desire for connection is not a weakness or a vice, but a human need. And that brings us to the present moment, where MDMA stands with one foot in the clinic and one in the club, straddling worlds that rarely intersect. Its future remains uncertain, but vastly more hopeful than at any time since the DEA slammed the door shut in 1988. The momentum behind therapeutic approval grows stronger each year. More countries are opening research programs. More therapists are training for the day MDMA becomes a legal tool in clinical practice. The cultural narrative is slowly shifting, from fear to curiosity, from stigma to understanding. But perhaps the most important shift is happening at the individual level. People who once saw ecstasy as nothing more than a party drug are now learning its deeper history. They are learning about Anton Kolisch in his quiet German lab, about Sasha Shulgin in his California workshop, about the therapists who risked their careers, about the patients who found healing after decades in darkness. They are learning that MDMA is not the story they were told. It is richer, stranger, and far more human. And as this understanding spreads, something remarkable happens. The fractured pieces of MDMA's identity begin to knit together. The club culture, the therapeutic breakthroughs, the political battles, the tragedies, the triumphs, they stop existing as separate narratives and become a single intertwined history. A history of a molecule that refused to disappear. A history of people searching for connection in the places where society told them not to look. A history of healing emerging from the least expected corners. And now, as we prepare to step into the final chapter of this story, one question remains. What happens when the love drug finally returns to the world, not as a symbol of rebellion, but as a guide toward healing? Because the future of MDMA isn't just about medicine. It isn't just about raves. It isn't just about chemistry. It's about us, our fears, our wounds, our longing for connection, and our willingness to rewrite old narratives. The last chapter begins not with the past, but with the possibility that lies ahead. The future rarely arrives all at once. It comes in ripples, whispers before headlines, quiet breakthroughs before cultural earthquakes. And the future of MDMA is arriving exactly this way, slowly, steadily, reshaping the landscape of mental health, nightlife, and society's understanding of what a drug can be. But to see where it's heading, we have to understand something deeper than chemistry or law. We have to understand why this molecule has survived everything thrown at it: wars, prohibition, moral panics, scientific errors, and decades of misunderstanding. It survived because people needed what it offered, not euphoria, not hype, not bright pills stamped with cartoon logos. What people needed, what they still need, is connection. And MDMA, more than almost any substance humans have discovered, reveals the ache that sits beneath the surface of modern life, an ache for warmth, for openness, for the feeling of being understood without judgment or fear. That ache is why a molecule synthesized in 1912, forgotten in a patent file, rediscovered in a Cold War arsenal, reborn in a California laboratory, and banned by governments across the world, still refuses to fade away. It persists because the need persists. And so, as the 2020s unfold, we find ourselves at the most unusual point in the entire history of MDMA. A moment where two parallel worlds are moving toward each other slowly, awkwardly, but inevitably. The world of medicine and the world of culture. Let's start with medicine. In clinical trials, MDMA is no longer an experiment. It is a tool, and in many cases, a profoundly effective one. The results from Phase 3 trials showed something almost unheard of. Large percentages of participants, trauma survivors, veterans, abuse survivors, experienced dramatic reductions in symptoms after just a few sessions. Not years of weekly therapy, not lifetime prescriptions, just a handful of carefully guided sessions. Imagine suffering from nightmares for decades and waking up one morning realizing you slept peacefully through the night. Imagine carrying guilt that wasn't yours to carry and finally feeling it lift. Imagine being able to sit with your memories, those memories, without fear, swallowing your voice. This is what the data showed. Not a miracle, but a mechanism. One that finally allows people to access therapy rather than ricochet off of it. And so, regulators began to reconsider their positions. In some countries, MDMA-assisted therapy is on the brink of becoming legal, not broadly, not for recreation, but within the quiet walls of clinics supervised by trained professionals. The irony is impossible to miss. The same molecule that governments once claimed had no therapeutic value is now being considered a legitimate treatment for one of the most stubborn conditions in psychiatry. The same compound that politicians said would damage your brain is now helping people rebuild theirs. The same substance once chased out of nightclubs by police officers may soon sit in amber bottles in therapist offices. History has a sense of humor, and it also has a sense of justice. But clinical approval is only one part of the story. Because culture, messy, unpredictable, emotional culture, moves on its own timeline. In the nightlife world, MDMA is experiencing something that resembles maturation. The chaotic excess of the 1990s has softened. Harm reduction practices, once demonized, are now embraced in many parts of Europe and Asia. Drug-checking booths appear at festivals not as underground operations, but as sanctioned, respected services. People test their substances, talk openly about safety, hydrate properly, and treat their experiences with intention rather than reckless abandon. Even online communities have changed. Conversations about MDMA now frequently reference mental health, integration, emotional processing, and personal growth, not just partying. People share stories about how MDMA helped them address long-standing anxieties or foster deeper empathy for themselves and others. It is not therapy, But for many, it is a glimpse of what healing feels like. And that glimpse can change the direction of a life. But there is a tension here, one that will define the decades ahead. As MDMA enters the world of medicine, it must shed the unpredictabilities of the underground. It must become standardized, dosage controlled, purity guaranteed, intentions clear. This is necessary, but it also means that the spontaneous, emotional, transformative experiences of the rave scene will not disappear, but they will exist outside the framework of legitimacy. Two forms of MDMA will coexist, one clinical, one cultural. And society will have to learn how to hold both truths at once. This raises difficult questions. What happens when a drug associated with dancing, love, and neon lights becomes a prescription medication? Will people feel shame seeking it for therapy? Will therapists judge? Will old stigmas resurface under new disguises? Will governments embrace healing while still punishing recreation? And perhaps the most complicated question of all, what does it mean if connection, one of the most basic human needs, requires chemical assistance for millions of people? These questions sit heavy, but they are necessary, because MDMA forces us to confront the emotional architecture of our world. It exposes how lonely society has become, how fractured our relationships can feel, how afraid we are to be vulnerable. It reveals, in a way few substances can, the deep human truth that openness is not a luxury, it's a need. And maybe that is why, for all the controversy, MDMA never truly left. It lingered at the edges of culture, waiting for a moment when society would be willing to reconsider not only the drug itself, but the emotional landscape that created its demand. Today, we are living through that moment. Therapists train quietly for the day MDMA-assisted therapy becomes legal. Patients fill out waiting lists, hoping they will soon have access to the treatment that changed the lives of strangers they've only read about. Policymakers, slowly but steadily, examine data instead of decades-old propaganda. Journalists explain neurochemistry instead of repeating panic-driven myths. Even the rave scene, so often dismissed as frivolous, is beginning to rediscover its roots in community and intention. People dance not just for escape, but for catharsis, for expression, for healing. The culture is older now, and in some ways wiser. And yet, as MDMA stands at the edge of acceptance, we must also acknowledge the responsibilities that come with that acceptance. For all its gifts, MDMA is not harmless. It demands respect. It requires care. It can open emotional doors that must be walked through with support, not stumbled through alone. In the underground, its risks are shaped by prohibition. In the clinic, its risks will be shaped by structure. But in both worlds, the same truth remains. MDMA is powerful because human vulnerability is powerful. It reveals what we hide. It softens what is rigid. It lets in light where the mind has long held shadows. And that is why the future of MDMA is not about the drug at all. It is about what the drug reveals, the emotional wounds we carry, the connections we crave, and the ways we have failed to meet our own psychological needs. So where does the story go from here? Perhaps within a decade, MDMA-assisted therapy will be widely available, integrated into treatment plans around the world. Perhaps harm reduction services will become standard at festivals, saving lives and reducing stigma. Perhaps society will finally accept that humans seek connection not because they are weak, but because they are wired that way. Or perhaps the future will unfold more slowly, with setbacks and resistance, as most social transformations do. But one thing is certain, MDMA will not fade quietly. It has survived too much, meant too much, revealed too much. It has become woven into the emotional history of an entire generation, and now into the scientific history of mental health. The drug the world once tried to bury has become a mirror held up to society, to trauma, to connection, to the human heart. And the final chapter, the one still being written, will determine not just the fate of MDMA, but the fate of how we understand healing itself. Because perhaps the real legacy of the love drug is not euphoria, not the glow of lights on a dance floor, not even the clinical breakthroughs. Its real legacy might be this: It reminded us that healing begins when fear loosens its grip. It reminded us that connection is not a luxury, but a lifeline. It reminded us that beneath our defenses, most of us simply want to feel safe enough to open. And maybe, just maybe, the future of MDMA is the future of a more compassionate world. Every story about a drug is, in the end, a story about people. Their fears, their desires, their pain, their hopes. And as we arrive at the quiet end of this long journey, tracing MDMA from a forgotten German laboratory to the beating heart of global youth culture, to the sterile precision of modern clinical trials, one truth becomes unmistakable. This molecule is not extraordinary because of its chemistry. It is extraordinary because of what it reveals about us. To understand MDMA is to understand the strange tension at the core of human experience, our longing to connect and our instinct to protect ourselves from harm. Trauma tightens that instinct until it becomes a cage. Isolation reinforces it. And somewhere in that gap, we lose the softness we were born with. MDMA doesn't create softness, it simply uncovers it, like brushstrokes removing dust from an artifact long buried. When the drug first emerged in therapeutic circles in the late 1970s, those who used it didn't describe wild euphoria or transcendence. They described clarity, courage, a gentle quieting of the inner storm long enough to see the wreckage left inside and long enough to begin rebuilding. And maybe that's why MDMA became more than a neurochemical curiosity. Maybe that's why ravers spoke about love and unity without irony. Maybe that's why therapists risked their careers, why researchers fought bureaucratic labyrinths for permissions, why patients spent decades waiting for a chance at something that finally made healing feel possible. Because beneath the clinical descriptions and the cultural myths, MDMA speaks directly to the part of us that wants to feel safe enough to open. And opening has never been easy for us. As we stand in the present, the world around us feels more connected and more disconnected than at any other time in human history. We live in a web of digital links, yet the emotional distance between people seems to widen year by year. Loneliness has become an epidemic. Anxiety disorders climb. Trauma saturates communities in quiet, unspoken ways. The pressures of modern life fracture people invisibly. The damage is often hidden in plain sight. MDMA's rise into the modern era is not a coincidence. It is a response to disconnection, a response to trauma, a response to emotional numbness, a response to a world that asks people to carry more than the nervous system was ever designed to hold. The rave scene, chaotic and imperfect though it was, understood this instinctively. When people danced together for hours on end, illuminated by moving lights and surrounded by countless others, all experiencing the same rhythmic heartbeat of music, they stumbled into something ancient, tribal, communal, a reconnection not only to each other, but to themselves. There were no words for it then. But if you listen closely to those who lived through that era, their descriptions sound surprisingly similar to people emerging from MDMA-assisted therapy today. Both groups talk about feeling seen, feeling free, feeling alive in a way that is difficult to articulate without slipping into metaphor. What began as a therapeutic tool became a cultural phenomenon, and what became a cultural phenomenon is now circling back to become a therapeutic tool again. History is folding over itself like the pages of a book returning to its beginning. But this time, we are approaching the molecule with far more wisdom, far more caution, far more reverence for its power. In research settings, MDMA is administered with preparation sessions, clinical supervision, integration therapy, and a level of care that acknowledges how emotionally profound the experience can be. This is not recreational indulgence. It is guided transformation. It is structured vulnerability. It is science and empathy working together. And as MDMA moves closer to legal therapeutic approval, the world is watching with curiosity and no small amount of apprehension. Some fear misuse, some fear cultural repercussions, some fear the dismantling of long-held narratives about drugs, therapy, and human suffering. But fear has shaped this story long enough. It shaped the bans, it shaped the stigma, it shaped the decades where people suffered in silence while a potentially life-changing tool remained locked away. And so today, Slowly, society is beginning to replace fear with understanding. That understanding begins with acknowledging the truth. MDMA is not a cure. It cannot erase trauma. It cannot fix relationships on its own. It cannot replace community, therapy, or love. What it can do, what it has always done when used responsibly, is create a moment of spaciousness in the mind, a temporary softness where healing can finally begin. This is why so many people describe MDMA-assisted therapy not as euphoric but as honest, not as escapism but as confrontation, not as a chemical illusion but as a psychological unveiling. In that unveiling lies its power and its vulnerability. Because when people open, they must be supported, they must be seen, they must be guided. MDMA is not simply a chemical, it is a responsibility, one that therapists, patients, policymakers, and communities must hold with both care and clarity. But if we can hold it well, the future may look very different. Imagine a world where a veteran returning from war no longer waits 20 years to feel whole again. Imagine a world where survivors of abuse can access treatments that help them reclaim their lives. Imagine a world where trauma therapy is not synonymous with decades of struggle, but with hope. Imagine a world where the rave culture's idealism, connection, unity, empathy is not confined to dance floors, but infused into the way society cares for its most wounded members. This isn't a fantasy. It is the direction we are heading. In a decade, people may look back on the early 21st century and marvel that we ever hesitated to explore the therapeutic potential of MDMA. Just as we now look back at the early days of psychotherapy or the initial resistance to antidepressants, future generations may see this moment as a turning point, a moment when the world reconsidered what healing could look like. But the story does not end with legalization or with rave culture or even with therapy. The story ends, or perhaps continues, with something larger. MDMA forces us to re-examine the emotional architecture of being human. It invites questions about vulnerability, trust, connection, trauma, and the ways society supports or neglects mental health. It challenges us to rethink why we fear softness, why we stigmatize emotional openness, why we value independence over interdependence, and why vulnerability is so often treated as weakness. Maybe the molecule itself isn't the point. Maybe it never was. Maybe MDMA is simply the mirror, reflecting back to us all the things we have forgotten how to feel on our own. Connection, empathy, safety, openness, compassion for others and for ourselves. The love drug was never really about love in the romantic sense. It was about the rediscovery of emotional presence. It was about remembering what it feels like to move through the world without armor. And if that is the lesson we carry forward, whether in clinics, in conversations, or in the quiet, private spaces of our own minds, then the story of MDMA is not just a tale of chemistry or culture. It is a reminder that beneath our defenses, most of us are longing for the same thing, to be held in a moment of understanding, to be seen without fear, to be allowed, even briefly, to open. And perhaps that is MDMA's true legacy. One that will endure long after the rave lights fade and the clinical trials become standard practice. Not the molecule, not the high, not the controversy, but the truth it revealed. Connection is medicine. Compassion is transformative, and healing begins the moment we feel safe enough to be ourselves. That is the real story behind the so-called love drug. Not ecstasy, not Molly, not MDMA, but the human heart rediscovered.